The air in the press conference room was thick with tension. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, flashes illuminating the young woman standing at the podium. A low murmur of voices rippled through the crowd, journalists whispering, adjusting their microphones, exchanging skeptical glances. At the center of it all stood a teenage girl, her fingers gripping the edges of the podium so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded beneath the slightly oversized blazer she had borrowed from her mother that morning. It didn't quite fit, but she didn't care. She wasn't here to impress them with appearances. She was here to expose the truth. A deep voice cut through the noise. "Miss Sinclair," a reporter in the front row called out, his tone edged with doubt. "You're 17. No legal background. No formal training. And yet, you claim to have uncovered a systemic injustice that's been overlooked for decades. Why should anyone believe you?" Ava Sinclair lifted her chin. She had expected this. "They don't have to believe me," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves coiling in her stomach. "They just have to look at the evidence." She reached into her bag, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it on the podium with a deliberate thud. A flicker of surprise crossed the faces in the audience. "Inside this folder," she continued, "are documents, testimonies, and undeniable proof that schools across the country have been systematically denying opportunities to students based on factors they can't control. Proof that those in power knew about it and did nothing." A hush fell over the room. For the first time since she stepped onto that stage, Ava saw something shift in their eyes. Doubt was still there, but now there was something else. Curiosity. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she flipped open the folder, revealing a stack of carefully organized documents. She had spent months collecting them, long nights, sifting through legal archives, digging through school board records, tracking down students and families who had been affected but never heard. Each page inside that folder told a story, a piece of a much larger puzzle that no one had wanted to see. The reporters in front of her leaned in slightly, their skepticism still present but now tinged with intrigue. She knew she had only a few moments to keep their attention. If she fumbled now, they would write her off as just another overzealous teenager with a conspiracy theory. She took a slow breath, steady, strong, just like she had rehearsed. "The first case," she began, lifting the top document, "is from Brookfield High School. In 2019, a student named Daniel Reyes applied for an advanced science program. He was one of the top students in his class. Perfect grades, strong test scores, but he was rejected. A man in the audience, a journalist from the Daily Chronicle, crossed his arms. Students get rejected from programs all the time. Miss Sinclair, what makes this different?" Ava had been waiting for that question. "What makes this different," she said, flipping to the next page, "is that Daniel's rejection letter was identical word for word to the one received by 15 other students that same year. Students who all came from low-income families. Students who, unlike their wealthier classmates, didn't have access to private tutors or recommendation letters from well-connected parents." She slid the paper forward so the cameras could catch a glimpse of it. But the most important detail: these students were never actually considered. Their applications were discarded before they even reached the selection committee. A murmur spread through the room. Ava pressed forward. And this wasn't just Brookfield High. It happened at Glenwood Academy, at Jefferson Prep, at over a dozen schools across the state. The students were led to believe they weren't good enough, but the truth is, they were never even given a chance. A heavy silence followed. A reporter in the back cleared her throat. "Do you have proof that this was intentional? Schools make mistakes all the time. How do you know this wasn't just clerical error?" Ava's stomach clenched, but she didn't hesitate. "I thought of that," she admitted. "So I kept digging." She turned the page, revealing a printed email thread. "This is an internal conversation between two administrators at Jefferson Prep. They discuss a priority list. Students who were pre-approved for the program based on, and I quote, factors that ensure long-term success and donor support. She paused, letting the words sink in. They weren't looking for the best students, she continued. They were looking for the students who fit their mold. And the ones who didn't, they never stood a chance. More cameras flashed. The energy in the room shifted. No longer were the reporters just watching. They were paying attention. But Ava knew that with attention came danger. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Somewhere in the back of the room, a door creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his presence immediately unsettling. He didn't carry a notepad or a camera. He wasn't a journalist. Ava's stomach twisted. She didn't know who he was, but she had a feeling she was about to find out. Ava felt it before she fully saw him, the shift in atmosphere. The way conversations dropped to a murmur as the man in the dark suit moved through the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an expression that revealed nothing. His gaze scanned the press conference with a calculated stillness, like a predator surveying its surroundings. Her pulse quickened. Was he from one of the schools? A lawyer? A government official? She had prepared for pushback, but she wasn't naive. There were people who had spent years keeping the system in place, people who wouldn't appreciate a 17-year-old digging up their secrets and handing them to the press. Ava forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to get rattled. She gripped the podium, turning back to the reporters. This isn't just about rejected applications, she continued, pushing forward despite the weight settling in her chest. It's about an entire system designed to keep certain students out, students who, if given the same opportunities, would have been just as successful as their wealthier peers. This is discrimination hiding behind bureaucracy, and it has gone unchecked for years. The room was tense now, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone inside. Some reporters were furiously scribbling notes, others whispering to their colleagues. But the man in the suit didn't react. He simply stood near the back, watching. And then, as if on cue, her phone vibrated. Ava's fingers twitched against the podium. She had silenced all notifications before stepping onto the stage. Only a handful of people had her number, and none of them would be texting her now. With a quick, discreet glance, she checked the screen. Unknown number. You need to stop. Now. A chill crept up her spine. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. It could have been a coincidence, a prank. But deep down, she knew better. The man in the suit was still watching her. He knew she had seen the message. For the first time since she started speaking, doubt flickered at the edges of her resolve. Not because she was afraid of being wrong, she wasn't, but because she was starting to understand just how far certain people would go to keep the truth buried. A reporter near the front raised his hand. Ava, are you saying this corruption extends beyond the school system? Do you believe higher officials knew about it? She hesitated, just for a second. That second was all the man in the suit needed. He turned and walked out the door. No questions, no objections, just left. And somehow, that was more terrifying than anything else. The door clicked shut behind the man in the suit, but the weight of his presence lingered like a shadow stretching across the room. Ava could still feel the chill of that message seeping into her bones. You need to stop. Now. Her mind raced. Someone was watching her. Someone powerful enough to know her number, to send a warning in the middle of a press conference. But who? The school board? A politician? Someone higher up? She forced herself to refocus. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her, not now. Ava lifted her chin and turned back to the reporters. The people who built this system don't want it to change, she said, voice steady despite the storm inside her. They've buried the truth for years, and they think they can keep doing it. But we're not going to let that happen. She tapped the folder on the podium. This evidence isn't just going to the press. It's going to lawyers, investigators, People who will hold them accountable. More cameras flashed. More pens scratched against notepads. A woman from Channel 6 News spoke up. Ava, do you believe your safety is at risk? The question cut through her like a blade. Ava hesitated for half a breath. She wanted to say no, that this was just a school board scandal, that no one would actually do anything to stop her. But the warning message, the man in the suit, the way the air had shifted it all, told her otherwise. She met the reporter's gaze. I believe this story is bigger than anyone realizes, she said carefully. And I believe some people would rather it stay buried. But I won't stop. The words left her lips with more conviction than she expected. She wouldn't stop. Not now. Ava closed the folder, gripping it tightly. That's all for today. The moment she stepped away from the podium, reporters started shouting questions over one another. Who's funding this cover-up? Are you working with any legal teams? Have you received any other threats? Ava ignored them. Her heart was hammering against her ribs as she slipped through the side exit, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. She needed air, space to think. But as soon as she pulled out her phone, another text appeared. Unknown number. That was your only warning. Ava inhaled sharply. This wasn't just about a school scandal anymore. She was officially in danger. Ava's breath hitched. She reread the message, her fingers tightening around the phone. That was your only warning. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The logical part of her brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was just an intimidation tactic, nothing more. But the deeper part of her, the part that had spent months uncovering lies and half-truths, knew better. This wasn't just about scaring her. It was a promise. The hallway was eerily quiet compared to the press conference room, the muffled hum of voices barely reaching her. A flickering overhead light cast long, distorted shadows against the tiled walls. Ava took a shaky breath and forced herself to move, walking toward the building's exit as casually as she could. But with every step, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She pushed open the heavy metal door leading to the parking lot, the cold evening air slamming into her like a wall. It had rained earlier, and the pavement shimmered under the glow of the streetlights. A few reporters were lingering near their cars, talking among themselves, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. Ava exhaled, trying to steady her thoughts. She had to be smart about this. If someone was trying to shut her up, she needed to figure out who and fast. Her best bet was to call someone. But who? The police? She had no proof of an actual crime, just vague threats and a gut feeling that something wasn't right. A lawyer? She didn't have one, and any legal team worth trusting would take time to reach. Then it hit her. Mr. Calloway. Her history teacher. He was the first person who had actually listened when she brought up the inconsistencies in school admissions. The one who had encouraged her to dig deeper. He had contacts in the education sector, and most importantly, he was one of the only adults she trusted. She scrolled through her contacts, found his number, and hit call. That meant she needed to switch lines now. Twice. Then, click. A voice, low and cautious. Ava? She exhaled in relief. Mr. Calloway, I think something's wrong. I just finished the press conference, and I got a message. I know, he cut in. His tone was tight. Where are you right now? Ava's stomach dropped. Outside the conference building. Why? What's going on? There was a pause. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he said, Ava, listen to me carefully. Don't go home. Her grip on the phone tightened. What? There are people watching you. You've pissed off the wrong people, and they're not going to let this go. His words were clipped, urgent. You need to get somewhere safe. Now. Ava's mind raced. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't just an empty threat. If Mr. Calloway knew something, if he was warning her not to go home, then this was worse than she had thought. She swallowed hard. Where do I go? A beat of hesitation. Then, meet me at the old bookstore on Westfield, the one near the train station. And Ava, make sure you're not being followed. The line went dead. Ava stood frozen for a second, her breath shallow. Then, gripping her bag tightly, she turned and started walking. Ava moved quickly, slipping between parked cars, as she made her way toward the main street. The conference building was in a busy part of town, which worked in her favor. More people meant more eyes. Less chance of someone making a move on her in broad daylight. But as she neared the intersection, she felt it again. The heavy weight of being watched. She forced herself to stay calm. Act natural. Don't run. Don't look back too quickly. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, angling it slightly, as if she were checking her reflection. And there it was. A black SUV, idling on the opposite side of the street. It hadn't been there a minute ago. Her stomach twisted. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but she knew it wasn't a coincidence. She turned the corner sharply, slipping into a side alley. Heart hammering, she pressed herself against the brick wall and listened. Engines. The unmistakable sound of tires rolling forward. They were following her. Ava clenched her fists, forcing down the panic clawing at her throat. She had two options. She could try to outrun them or outthink them. She chose the latter. Instead of bolting down the alley, she darted through a back entrance of a small cafe, ignoring the startled look from the barista behind the counter. She weaved through the tables, pushing open the front door and stepping back onto the main road, now across from where the SUV had been. It was still there, but now she was behind it. Ava moved fast, slipping into a group of pedestrians. She needed to get to Westfield, to the bookstore, to Callaway. If she didn't, she might not get another chance. The old bookstore on Westfield was the kind of place most people forgot existed. Wedged between a shuttered laundromat and a pawn shop, it had been there for decades, its wooden sign faded. Its front window cluttered with dust-covered books that nobody ever seemed to buy. The paint on the door was chipped, the brass handle worn smooth by years of use. Ava had passed it 100 times before, never giving it a second thought. But tonight, it was the only place in the city where she might find answers. She reached the door, breathless from the walk, no, the chase. Even though she'd managed to lose the black SUV, every step here had felt like a gamble. Every glance over her shoulder, a reminder that she was being hunted. She tried the door. Locked. Ava knocked twice. Then once more. Silence. Her pulse quickened. Had she misheard Callaway? Had something happened? Then click. The door cracked open, just enough for her to see a sliver of a face. He raised an eyebrow as she approached. His sharp eyes darted left and right before he pulled her inside and locked the door behind her. Ava, he exhaled, as if he wasn't sure she'd actually make it. What the hell is going on? She demanded. Callaway didn't answer right away. He turned and flicked on a dim overhead light, casting long shadows across the rows of bookshelves. The place smelled like dust and ink, a relic of another time. He led her toward the back, where a wooden table sat covered in papers, manila folders, and an old laptop. Ava barely had time to take it all in before he turned to face her, his expression grim. You shouldn't have done that press conference. Ava's jaw clenched. What was I supposed to do? Sit back and let them keep getting away with it? He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. You don't get it, kid. This isn't just about school funding. It's bigger than that. Ava crossed her arms. Then explain it to me. Callaway hesitated. Then, as if making a decision, he reached for one of the folders on the table and slid it toward her. She opened it and felt her stomach drop. Inside were documents, reports, correspondence, some of the same data she had uncovered, but now there were names attached. Big names, politicians, business executives, even a few well-known public figures. People who had been quietly benefiting from the broken education system for years. And at the center of it all, highlighted in red ink, was a name Ava recognized instantly. Congressman Walter Crane. She swallowed hard. Crane was a rising star in politics, a man who had built his entire campaign on education reform. He was the last person who should be tied to this scandal. But here he was. Ava's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. Bribes. Memos discussing ways to strategically underfund certain schools. Internal emails about suppressing reports that exposed discrimination. Her mind reeled. This is huge, she whispered. Calloway nodded. And you just put a target on your back by exposing the tip of the iceberg. Ava exhaled sharply, shaking her head. But why would someone like him want to sabotage schools? What does he even get out of this? Calloway tapped another document. A government contract. Crane has ties to private education companies. The worse public schools perform, the more parents panic, and the more they're willing to pay for better alternatives. His voice was laced with bitterness. It's not just about money, though. It's about control. Keep education broken, keep communities struggling, and you keep certain groups powerless. Ava's grip on the papers tightened. This wasn't just corruption. It was systematic. She looked up at Calloway. Why are you showing me this? Why haven't you gone public? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Because they don't just destroy careers, Ava. They destroy lives. The weight of his words settled over her. Ava knew she was in danger. But now, she was beginning to understand just how deep this ran. Her press conference had been a warning shot. And now, she was in the middle of a war she hadn't even realized she'd started. Ava's fingers traced the edge of the folder, her mind a whirlwind of half-formed thoughts and raw fear. The documents in front of her weren't just damning, they were explosive. The kind of evidence that could take down entire political careers. But they also meant one thing. She wasn't just some annoying high schooler causing trouble anymore. She was a threat. She met Calloway's gaze, her voice quieter than before. How long have you known about this? Too long. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I started putting the pieces together years ago, but I didn't have proof, not like this. And even if I did, people like Crane? He let out a bitter chuckle. They don't fall easily. Ava flipped through the pages again, bile rising in her throat as she absorbed more of what she was reading. These weren't just financial schemes or budget mismanagement. This was deliberate sabotage. Policies crafted to keep schools in certain districts underfunded while funneling resources elsewhere. While kids like her were left to scrape by. Her stomach twisted. So what do we do? Calloway studied her for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, battered USB drive. We get this to the right people. Ava took it carefully, feeling the weight of it despite its size. Who? There are journalists who've been sniffing around this for years. A few independent investigators who aren't afraid to go after politicians. But it has to be someone we trust, someone they can't buy or intimidate. Ava's mind raced through the possibilities. She knew a few reporters from the press conference, but most of them worked for networks that were either politically influenced or too afraid to take on something this massive. And then she thought of one name. Elliot Reyes. He wasn't a household name, but in investigative journalism circles, he was relentless. He had exposed corporate fraud, human rights violations, and, most importantly, he wasn't afraid of going after people in power. Reyes, she said firmly. We take it to him. Calloway nodded approvingly. Good choice. But that means we need to move fast. He stood, gathering the rest of the documents and slipping them into a weathered leather satchel. You'll take the USB to Reyes. I'll work on getting these copies in safe hands. Ava frowned. We should go together. Calloway shook his head. Too risky. If we're both caught, it's over. He hesitated, then added, besides, you've already made yourself the face of this fight. If they find me, I'm just an old teacher with a few conspiracy theories. But you, his expression darkened. You're a problem they need to erase. The reality of it settled over her like a cold weight. Erase. Not discredit. Not intimidate. Erase. Ava clenched her jaw. Then, I better not get caught. Calloway gave her a tight nod, then walked to the back of the bookstore. He pulled a book from one of the shelves, an old hardcover with a cracked spine, and the entire bookshelf clicked forward, revealing a hidden door. Ava blinked. Are you kidding me? Calloway managed a dry smirk. I told you, I've been doing this a long time. Beyond the door was a dimly lit passage, leading into what looked like an abandoned storage room. A second exit one that led to the alley behind the building. This is your way out, Calloway said. Once you leave here, don't go straight to Ray's. Take a few detours. Make sure you're not being followed. Ava took a steadying breath. She was about to step into the unknown. The thought should have terrified her. And it did. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Something that burned hotter than her doubt. Resolve. They wanted to silence her. She wasn't going to let them. Tightening her grip on the USB, she turned toward the hidden exit. See you on the other side, she muttered, and slipped into the shadows. The night air hit Ava like a slap to the face as she stepped out into the alley behind the bookstore. It smelled of damp concrete and distant cigarette smoke, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. She pulled her hood up, pressing the USB into her pocket as if she could make it disappear, one step at a time. The city was alive beyond the alley. Cars rumbled past, their headlights casting long shadows against brick walls. People bustled along the sidewalks, lost in their own worlds. To anyone watching, she was just another teenager walking alone at night. She needed to keep it that way. Ava forced herself to move at a normal pace, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. She cut across the street, slipping between groups of people when she could, trying to disappear into the flow of the city. She turned a corner, then stopped cold. The black SUV was parked just down the block. Her stomach twisted. They found me. Two men in suits stood near the vehicle, one checking his phone, the other scanning the street with a casual air that didn't fool her. They weren't just standing there. They were waiting. Ava's pulse pounded. She forced herself to keep walking, turning away from them as if she hadn't noticed. Don't look back. Don't speed up. She crossed another street. Slipping into the first open door, she found a late-night diner. A bell jingled as she stepped inside. The smell of coffee and grease hit her instantly. A waitress barely glanced up from behind the counter. A few scattered customers sat in red vinyl booths, nursing cups of coffee and plates of fries. Ava grabbed a menu and slid into a booth near the window, angling herself so she could see outside. The men were still there. One of them spoke into his phone, then nodded toward the diner. Her stomach clenched. They knew. She was out of time. Ava stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the salt shaker. The waitress shot her a curious look, but she ignored it, scanning the back of the diner. Exit. I need an exit. Then she saw it. A narrow hallway past the bathrooms, leading to what looked like a back door. She moved, heart pounding, weaving between tables as casually as she could. She was almost there. The bell above the door jingled again. The men had entered. Ava ducked into the hallway, pushing through the back door, just as she heard one of them call out, "Excuse me, miss." She bolted. The alley behind the diner was narrower than the last, the walls close enough to make her feel trapped. She sprinted toward the nearest street, not caring if they heard her now. Footsteps pounded behind her. She turned sharply, slipping through a gap between two buildings. Her shoulders scraped against rough brick, but she didn't stop. Keep running. Keep moving. She burst onto another street, nearly colliding with a cyclist. Horns blared. Someone shouted. She kept going. The city blurred around her as she ran, ducking through crowds, cutting across streets, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Then she spotted it, a subway entrance. Ava didn't think. She leaped down the stairs two at a time, shoving her way through the turnstile just as a train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open. She jumped inside. The doors closed behind her a second later. She turned, breathless, staring through the glass. One of the men had reached the platform just a second too late. He locked eyes with her as the train began to move. Ava exhaled shakily, gripping the metal pole beside her. She wasn't safe. Not yet. But she had bought herself time. And right now, that was the only thing keeping her alive. Ava sat slumped in the subway seat, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The train rattled along the tracks, its fluorescent lights casting everything in a dull, sickly glow. Around her, passengers sat in their own silent worlds, some staring at their phones, others nodding off, a few throwing half-curious glances her way before returning to their business. No one knew who she was. No one knew that she was running for her life. She pressed her fingers against the USB drive in her pocket, as if to reassure herself that it was still there. It was. But for how much longer? Her mind spun with 1,000 questions. How had they found her so fast? Had she been followed from Calloway's shop? Was there a leak somewhere, someone feeding them her movements? Or had they just cast a wide enough net to trap her in it? None of it mattered now. She had to disappear. Ava glanced at the subway map above the doors, tracing the lines with her eyes. The train was headed toward the outer boroughs. Good. If she stayed underground long enough, switched routes a few times, she could lose them. But then what? She couldn't go home. Her mother was still at work. But if anyone had been watching her, they might already be staking out the apartment. And her mother had no idea what Ava was involved in. If those men showed up asking questions, would she even know to lie? No, Ava couldn't risk it. A lump formed in her throat. She had never felt more alone. The train jerked to a stop, the doors hissing open. A few people shuffled out. A few more got in. And that's when Ava saw him. A man mid-40s, well-built, wearing a dark gray overcoat, stepped into the car. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge anyone, but something about him made every alarm in Ava's brain go off at once. He wasn't just another commuter. He was here for her. Her body tensed, but she forced herself to stay still. Don't react. Don't let him know you see him. He moved down the aisle, casually glancing at passengers as he walked. His coat was too heavy for the warm subway, his hands stuffed into his pockets hiding something. A weapon? A badge? He stopped just 2 seats away from her. Ava's skin prickled. She had to move. Now, the train began slowing again, another station coming up. Ava gripped the metal pole beside her and pulled herself to her feet just as the doors opened. She stepped out, heart hammering. And so did he. Ava didn't look back. She walked fast, but not too fast, weaving between people as she reached the stairs leading back up to the street. If you run, he'll know for sure. Her hands were shaking. The moment she reached the sidewalk, she turned left, slipping into the first crowd she saw. Her hoodie was dark. Maybe she could blend in. Maybe. A shadow moved in her peripheral vision. The man was still following her. Her pulse spiked. She turned another corner, heading toward a narrow side street. It was risky, but she needed to see just how persistent he was. Seconds later, she heard footsteps behind her. Not running. Not chasing. Just following. She turned again, ducking into an alley, her sneakers splashing in a puddle as she moved faster. There was a door to a laundromat up ahead open. If she could just. A hand grabbed her wrist. Ava twisted violently, yanking herself free. Hey. She didn't let him finish. She ran. Shoving past a couple of people, she bolted toward the laundromat, sliding inside just as she heard the man curse behind her. The place was nearly empty, just a bored-looking woman folding clothes, an old man reading a newspaper. No time. She darted toward the back, where an emergency exit led to another alley. The second she was through, she sprinted again, lungs burning, legs aching. She turned onto a busier street. People, lights, traffic. She kept running. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stop. Ava didn't slow down until the burning in her lungs became unbearable. She ducked into the first open doorway she could find, an old convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint smell of stale coffee. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at her. Ava walked to the back of the store, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were shaking. She reached for a bag of chips from the shelf, not because she was hungry, but because she needed to look normal. She stole a glance toward the front window. The man in the gray coat was standing across the street. Her stomach turned to ice. He wasn't looking directly at her, but he didn't have to. He knew she was inside. Ava swallowed hard. She needed to get out. But how? She turned her gaze toward the back of the store. There was an employee's only door. Maybe. A shadow moved outside. A second man had joined him. Ava's chest tightened. They sent backup. The store was too small. There were no crowds to disappear into here. If she walked out, they'd corner her in seconds. She was trapped. Her mind raced. Think, Ava, think. She grabbed a soda from the fridge and walked toward the cashier, forcing a small smile. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Is there a back exit?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Ava hesitated. "Lying would take too long. I think someone's following me." The cashier frowned, setting down her magazine. She gave Ava a long, assessing look, then sighed. "Teenagers these days," she muttered, shaking her head. Then she jerked her chin toward the door behind the counter. "Go. And don't make a mess." Relief flooded Ava's chest. "Thank you," she whispered, before slipping through the door. The storage room was cluttered with boxes of snack foods and cleaning supplies. But she barely noticed. She darted past them, reaching for the back door. A metal lock. Her heart dropped. No, no, no. She twisted the handle frantically, but it didn't budge. Ava spun around, eyes searching for anything useful. A crowbar sat on a shelf nearby. She grabbed it without thinking. "If they come in here, I'll..." A knock sounded on the storage room door. Not from the alley. From inside the store. Ava froze. "Ava," a voice called softly. Her breath caught. They knew her name. "How?" "Come on," the voice continued. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Ava gripped the crowbar tighter, stepping backward until her back hit the locked exit. No escape. The doorknob turned. Ava's pulse thundered in her ears. "I won't let them take me." The door swung open, and Ava swung first. The crowbar sliced through the air. The man barely had time to react before it connected with his forearm, sending him stumbling back with a sharp grunt of pain. Ava didn't hesitate. She shoved past him, bolting back into the store. The cashier let out a startled yelp, but Ava didn't stop. She sprinted toward the front door, nearly knocking over a rack of gum. The second man, outside, spotted her. His eyes widened. Ava crashed through the door, slamming into him with her full weight. They both went down. She scrambled up first, ignoring the burning in her knees. And then she ran. Past the store, past the alley, down the street, down another, and another, until the only sound left was her own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. Her body ached. Her hands were scraped. The USB drive was still in her pocket. She was still free. But for how much longer? Ava didn't know how long she had been running. Her legs felt like lead, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. But she didn't dare stop. The city stretched around her in an endless maze of neon lights, honking cars, and strangers who didn't know who couldn't know that she was being hunted. She turned another corner, nearly colliding with a man carrying a bag of groceries. "Watch it," he barked, but Ava barely registered the words. She needed to disappear. The thought pounded through her skull with every heartbeat. She forced herself to slow down, to stop looking over her shoulder every few seconds. Act normal. If she kept running, she'd draw attention that could get her caught. But where could she go? Her mother's apartment was out of the question. Her friends wouldn't be safe either. The only place that came to mind was Calloway's old shop, but she had no idea if he would even help her. And what if they were watching him too? Ava ducked into a crowded intersection, weaving through pedestrians as they crossed the street. The rush of people gave her a momentary sense of security, but it wouldn't last. She needed to think. Fast. Then she saw it. A rundown motel at the edge of the block, its neon vacancy sign flickering erratically. It was perfect. Ava quickened her pace, slipping inside. The air smelled like cigarette smoke and stale carpet, and the receptionist behind the counter barely looked up from his phone. Ava walked up, digging through her pocket for the crumpled bills she had left. "I need a room," she said, keeping her voice steady. The man exhaled through his nose, barely interested. "ID?" Ava's stomach twisted. She didn't have one. And even if she did, she couldn't use it. "My boyfriend's on his way with it," she lied smoothly. "But I can pay now." The man gave her a lazy, unimpressed look. Then he sighed and pulled a key from behind the desk. "Cash only." Ava shoved the money at him, grabbed the key, and hurried toward the stairs before he could change his mind. The room was exactly what she expected: dim, musty, and depressing. The bedspread had cigarette burns, the wallpaper was peeling, and the TV was one of those old boxy ones from a decade ago. But it had a lock on the door, and for now, that was all that mattered. Ava double-locked it anyway, then shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. Finally, she let herself collapse onto the bed. Her entire body ached. Her mind spun. She had barely processed everything that had happened. The chase. The storage room. The fact that they knew her name. Ava sat up, pulling the USB drive from her pocket. This tiny piece of plastic and metal, this was why they were after her. Calloway had told her it was important. But how important? Ava's fingers hovered over the zipper of her backpack. Inside was her old laptop, a cheap, half-broken thing she had used for school. It was slow, outdated, barely functional, but it would do. She hesitated. If the drive had tracking software, plugging it in could expose her location. But if she didn't look now, she might never get the chance. Her pulse pounded as she powered on the laptop. The screen flickered, the fan wheezed, and then finally it loaded. She inserted the USB. A single folder popped up. Ava clicked it open. Dozens of documents filled the screen: files, spreadsheets, memos, and one video. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She clicked it. A grainy security feed appeared. A timestamp in the corner 6 months ago. The footage showed an office. A man sat behind a desk, his back to the camera. Across from him sat another figure, someone Ava recognized immediately. Senator Alan Wexler. Her stomach twisted. Wexler was one of the most powerful men in the country. And here he was, in a secret meeting with. Ava squinted. The other man shifted, turning toward the camera just enough for his face to be visible. Her blood ran cold. It was the same man who had chased her today. She hit pause, her heart slamming against her ribs. What the hell was this? She scanned the folder again, opening one of the text documents. Her eyes darted across the words. Unauthorized fund transfers. Diverted grants. Falsified reports. Concealed discrimination cases. A sickening realization settled over her. This wasn't just about education reform. This was corruption at the highest level. Wexler and his people weren't just blocking funding for schools. They were stealing it, funneling millions into private accounts, covering up discriminatory practices. and eliminating anyone who got in their way. And now they knew Ava had proof. Her hands trembled as she closed the laptop. She had been right to run. But running wouldn't be enough. She had to find a way to expose this. Before they found her, Ava's fingers hovered over the laptop keyboard, her mind racing. The files on the USB drive were more than just damning, they were explosive. Proof of illegal funding transfers, government officials conspiring to suppress education reform, and worst of all, evidence that people who had spoken out had been silenced. She swallowed hard. She had always suspected corruption ran deep, but this wasn't just backroom deals and bribes. This was an entire system, built to keep power in the hands of a few while millions suffered. And now she was holding the key to exposing it. Ava inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. Okay, what now? Going to the police was out of the question. Who knew how far this conspiracy reached? The Department of Justice might have been involved, but they were also the ones trying to cover this up. If she turned over the files to the wrong person, she'd disappear before morning. Journalists. That was her best option. She needed someone high profile, someone untouchable. If she could get this into the hands of a national reporter, someone with real reach, it would be impossible to bury. Her fingers moved quickly as she searched. Who could she trust? A list of investigative journalists popped up. Names she recognized from exposes on political corruption, government leaks, whistleblower protections. One stood out. Mark Callahan, senior political correspondent, The Tribune. Ava had followed his work for years. He had broken some of the biggest stories in modern politics, from corporate scandals to leaked intelligence reports. Most importantly, he had a reputation for not backing down. She clicked on his profile, searching for contact info. Then, a knock at the door. Ava froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The motel was nearly empty. She hadn't told anyone where she was. She reached for the crowbar she had stolen from the convenience store earlier, her heart hammering. Another knock. Louder. Ava. A chill ran down her spine. It was a woman's voice, not one she recognized. "We know you're in there," the voice continued, calm but firm. "Open the door, and we can talk." Ava didn't move. She looked around the room, searching for an exit. The window she could squeeze through it, but the fire escape was rusted and led straight down to the parking lot. They'd be waiting. The chair under the doorknob rattled slightly as the person outside tested the handle. Ava's grip tightened around the crowbar. "If you don't come out now," the woman said, her tone sharpening, "we'll come in." Ava's mind raced. Then, the chair jerked. They were forcing the door. She had seconds. Ava bolted for the window, shoving it open. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the sill, gripping the rusted fire escape railing, just as the door burst open behind her. A voice shouted. She didn't wait to hear what they said. She jumped. The metal structure groaned under her weight. She scrambled down, skipping rungs, her feet barely touching the rusted metal. A car screeched somewhere nearby. She hit the pavement, stumbling forward. And then, a hand grabbed her wrist. Ava twisted, swinging the crowbar on instinct. It connected with something solid. A grunt of pain. The grip loosened. She ripped free and ran. Shouts rang out behind her. Footsteps pounded against the pavement. But Ava had one advantage. She knew these streets. She darted down an alley, leaping over a fallen trash can. Left turn. Right. Another left. And then, the city opened up before her. Crowds. Noise. A subway entrance. Her best shot. She shoved past commuters, nearly tripping down the stairs as she reached the platform. A train was pulling in. The voices behind her grew louder. "Come on, come on." The doors slid open. She lunged inside just as they started to close. A man in a suit gave her a strange look, but she ignored him. The train lurched forward. Through the window, she saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of the platform, watching. The woman who had knocked on her door, and the man from the storage room. Their faces unreadable. Ava exhaled shakily, sinking into a seat. She had made it. But they weren't giving up, and she was running out of time. The subway rattled beneath Ava's feet, but she barely noticed. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, sweat sticking to the back of her neck. The USB drive felt heavier than ever in her pocket, as if the weight of everything she had uncovered was sinking deeper into her skin. Her mind couldn't stop replaying the last few hours. The storage room. The men in suits. The woman who had known her name without ever seeing her face. Someone had tipped them off. Someone had betrayed her. But who? Ava's hands curled into fists. Calloway? No, he was paranoid, to the point of obsession. If anything, he was probably already in hiding. Then who? Her thoughts flicked back to the press conference. The way the reporters had shifted in their seats when she dropped her evidence. The way some of them whispered into their phones. She had trusted the wrong person. One of them had sold her out. The train screeched into the next station, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering. Ava stayed in her seat. She had learned by now not to get off at obvious stops. The men in suits would be checking cameras, waiting for patterns. If they thought she was heading straight for Callahan, they'd already be waiting for her. No, she had to throw them off. Ava pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. Mark Callahan, the Tribune. She hesitated. What if he was part of it? But then she thought of the files. The video. If anyone could get this story out, it was him. Her thumb hovered over the call button. A vibration made her heart lurch. Another message. Unknown number. Nice trick at the motel. But you're running out of places to hide. Ava's breath caught. They were watching her. Her eyes darted around the train car faces buried in newspapers, headphones plugged in, eyes glazed over. But someone here was watching. Her fingers clenched around the phone. Screw it. She hit call. The line rang once, twice. Then a tired voice answered. This is Callahan. Ava's heart nearly stopped. He sounded older than she imagined, rough, worn out, like someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. I have something for you, she whispered, keeping her voice low. Proof of government corruption, funding fraud, bribes, intimidation, everything. I need to meet. There was a long pause on the other end. You got a name, kid? Ava swallowed hard. Ava Sinclair. Another pause. Jesus. He already knew who she was. You're the girl from the press conference. Yeah, she said, glancing over her shoulder. The man across from her was pretending to scroll through his phone, but his eyes flicked toward her every few seconds. They're following me. I know. His voice was flat, as if he had been expecting this. Where are you now? On the Green Line, heading north. You're going the wrong way. Ava's pulse spiked. What? If they're watching the trains, they're expecting you to head into the city. He paused. You need to go south. There's a safe house across the river. I'll text you the address. Ava's eyes darted to the map above the door. South. That meant she needed to switch lines now. Okay. One more thing, kid, Callahan said, his voice lowering. Don't trust anyone. Not even me. The line went dead. Ava's throat went dry. The doors slid open. She stood, heart pounding. She didn't know if she was walking into salvation or into the hands of the people who wanted her dead. Ava gripped the metal pole as the subway doors slid shut behind her. The train jerked forward, and she took a steadying breath, trying to ignore the weight of her decision. She had made the call. There was no turning back. Light. Blinding, sterile light. Ava's eyes fluttered open, and a sharp pain lanced through her skull. The scent of disinfectant filled her nostrils. She tried to move, but her wrists were restrained. Panic surged through her veins. Then, a voice. Low, steady. Familiar. You're awake. Ava turned her head, blinking against the harsh light. Mark Callahan sat beside her hospital bed, his arm in a sling, his face shadowed with exhaustion. What? Her throat was dry. What happened? Callahan exhaled, rubbing his temple. You got the files out. The memory hit her like a freight train. The USB. The email. The send to all. Her breath caught. Did they see it? Callahan nodded. Not just them. The whole damn world. Ava's pulse quickened. And the people who? They're done, Callahan said firmly. The DOJ launched an immediate investigation. Indictments are already being filed. It's over. She let out a shaky breath. Over. But at what cost? She swallowed, glancing around the room. Who brought me here? Callahan hesitated. The people who shot you weren't trying to kill you. They wanted to silence you. But when your files went public, you became untouchable. He leaned forward. You have no idea how many people are on your side now. Ava stared at him. She had spent so long fighting, running, surviving. And now? What happens to me? She whispered. Callahan smirked. That's the thing about whistleblowers, kid. Once the truth is out, you don't just fade away. Ava looked out the window. The city stretched beyond the glass, alive with lights. She wasn't the same girl who started this. She wasn't just some student who stumbled onto a case too big for her. She was someone who changed history. And now, the world was watching. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Unknown number, Bridgeport Station, 11 p.m. Alone. Ava clenched her jaw. She didn't like the demand alone, but what choice did she have? If she hesitated now, she might never get another chance. She glanced around the subway car. The man who had been watching her before was gone. Maybe he got off at the last stop. Or maybe he was just hiding better now. Ava reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the USB drive. It felt small, almost insignificant. Yet she knew its contents were powerful enough to bring an empire crashing down. Her heart pounded as the train continued south. Bridgeport Station, 10:57 p.m. The station was nearly empty. Dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the cracked tile floor. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarettes. Ava pulled her hoodie tighter around herself, her eyes scanning every corner. A few stragglers loitered near the benches, but no one stood out. Then she saw him. Mark Callahan. He leaned against a rusted pillar, his trench coat pulled tight against the wind. His face was half hidden beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap, but she recognized him immediately. The same man who had spent years exposing corruption, now standing before her, looking just as hunted as she felt. He raised an eyebrow as she approached. You actually came, he muttered. Ava stopped a few feet away. You think I had a choice? Callahan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Kid, you have no idea how deep this goes. Ava pulled out the USB drive. Then let's change that. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, slipping it into his coat pocket. That's all of it? He asked. Ava nodded. Callahan looked around, lowering his voice. We don't have much time. I have a safe house. A gunshot rang out. Ava ducked instinctively, her ears ringing. Callahan stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. Run, he gasped. Ava's breath hitched. A man in a dark coat was moving toward them, a gun glinting in his hand. She turned on her heel and sprinted. The final choice. Ava's feet pounded against the pavement as she ran through the deserted streets. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her lungs burned. Her mind raced. She needed to think. Fast. Then she spotted it, a small, 24-hour internet cafe at the corner of the street. The neon Wi-Fi available sign flickered weakly above the door. She skidded to a stop, darting inside. The place was empty, except for a bored-looking cashier. Ava dropped into the nearest computer station, fumbling to insert a flash drive. She had one last move left. The screen blinked to life. She opened her email, attached the files, and hit send to all. Ava barely had time to breathe before the door burst open. The last thing she saw was a figure in black moving toward her. Then everything went dark.